Imagine a man sitting alone in a dimly lit library at 2 a.m. The world outside is asleep, but inside his mind, galaxies are colliding. He's not studying for an exam, not following a curriculum, not being told what to read or when to stop. He's following the trail of his own curiosity, a spark that refuses to die. Page after page, idea after idea, he drifts into forbidden territories of thought that no institution dared to mark on its maps. And in that private rebellion, he becomes something rare, almost dangerous, an autodidact. But there's a problem. The moment someone learns without permission, the system begins to tremble. Not violently, not visibly, but like a calm surface hiding deep seismic shifts beneath it. The autodidact, by his very existence, exposes a quiet but terrifying truth: that freedom of mind is incompatible with systems of control. Alan Watts once observed that education, as we know it, often teaches us what to think rather than how to think. That subtle shift between a mind that questions and a mind that conforms is where civilization builds its invisible cages. We're taught that to succeed, we must first submit to exams, to authorities, to syllabi designed by unseen committees. The self-taught thinker, by contrast, refuses this submission. He reclaims the right to direct his own evolution. This is why the system hates autodidacts, not because they fail to fit in, but because they reveal that fitting in was never necessary. They dissolve the illusion that wisdom must be conferred by ceremony or certified by institutional stamp. They expose the machinery that keeps human potential in chains. To understand this, we must first realize that most systems, educational, political, economic, are not designed for growth, but for predictability. Predictable workers, predictable voters, predictable minds. A system that prizes uniformity cannot tolerate the self-taught because such minds cannot be forecasted. They don't behave according to the model. They break pattern, improvise, wander off script. And in a world built on the efficiency of sameness, unpredictability becomes heresy. The autodidact, then, is more than a curious learner. He's a psychological insurgent. His education is not a ladder, but a labyrinth. He learns not to reach an endpoint, but to deepen his own consciousness. He's dangerous precisely because he's difficult to control. His motives come from within, not from external incentives. You can threaten a student with grades, debt, or failure. But what do you do with someone who learns for the sheer ecstasy of knowing? The tragedy is that the system hides this danger behind benevolent rhetoric. It calls its structures opportunities, its hierarchies meritocracies. But behind the language of empowerment lies a deeper project: domestication. It's not that the system wants us ignorant. It simply wants our knowledge aligned. It wants our curiosity tamed to serve the machine. Yet the autodidact rejects alignment. He lives in what Alan Watts called the unprogrammed life, a state where curiosity flows naturally, without permission or agenda. In such a life, learning becomes an act of liberation. Each discovery is a declaration of independence, each question a quiet rebellion. But that freedom comes with a cost. The autodidact is often misunderstood, alienated, even mocked. His questions threaten others who have invested their identities in being told what to think. And so, society invents subtle mechanisms of exclusion: credentials, titles, reputations, signs of belonging to the approved order of knowledge. The man in the library doesn't belong. He never will. But perhaps that's precisely what makes him free. For every page he turns, he loosens another link in the chain that binds the collective mind. He is the system's greatest threat and its only hope. As Nietzsche once wrote, the surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently. The autodidact is the living refutation of that corruption, a reminder that true education begins not in obedience, but in wonder. And yet, if the system fears this kind of freedom, what exactly does it seek to preserve? The system's hatred of autodidacts isn't born of spite. It's born of strategy. The architecture of control doesn't survive on violence alone. It thrives on quiet dependence. It's an intricate symphony of incentives and fears, where every note is designed to keep human curiosity contained within predictable boundaries. Imagine again our self-taught wanderer, the man in the library. While he explores the universe through thought, others march through corridors under fluorescent lights, their futures measured in grades, credits, and compliance. Each corridor ends with a door labeled success, but behind it waits not freedom, but a deeper form of captivity, a life defined by external validation. Dependence begins early. From childhood, we're trained to equate authority with truth. The teacher becomes the oracle, the textbook the scripture, the exam the ritual of worthiness. We learn that knowledge flows in one direction, from the institution to the individual, and that our role is to receive, memorize, and regurgitate. Questions that wander beyond the syllabus are punished as distractions. Curiosity without purpose is treated as waste. This isn't accidental. Systems need obedience more than they need enlightenment. A genuinely educated mind, a mind capable of original thought, is unpredictable, and unpredictability is bad for business. So the machinery of schooling becomes an early rehearsal for economic servitude. You're graded not on depth of thought, but on how well you replicate a framework. You're rewarded for mastering rules, not questioning why the rules exist. By the time you enter the workforce, the conditioning is complete. You're told to follow procedure, to stay in your lane, to trust the experts. You've been trained to depend on systems, on credentials, on authority itself. The system doesn't need to imprison you physically because it has already colonized your imagination. You're free to think, but only within the parameters it provides. Autodidacts terrify this architecture because they reverse the flow of dependence. They make learning personal again. They draw their authority from experience, intuition, and synthesis, not from external approval. When such a person speaks, they speak from authenticity, not credential. And authenticity cannot be mass-produced. Alan Watts warned against what he called the cult of utility, a worldview in which everything must have an immediate practical purpose to be considered valuable. In such a culture, self-directed learning is suspect because it's unpredictable. What if someone learns philosophy not to earn a degree but to understand the nature of consciousness? What if they study physics not to build machines, but to contemplate beauty? These are not efficient pursuits, but they are profoundly human. The system, obsessed with output, views this kind of learning as wasteful. Can't measure wonder, can't grade curiosity, can't monetize self-awareness. So it subtly shames it out of existence. Schools become factories of the measurable. Workplaces become temples of productivity. The autodidact, with his restless exploration, disrupts both. You can see this tension everywhere, in the way companies demand degrees for jobs that don't require them, or how society equates prestige with wisdom. We've built a culture that mistakes certification for competence. The self-taught, by succeeding without permission, unravel that illusion. They prove that expertise can bloom outside institutions, that intelligence can exist without validation. And so, the architecture of control adapts. It creates new hierarchies, new gatekeepers, new forms of intellectual debt. The more knowledge becomes accessible, the more the system builds symbolic toll booths, algorithms, institutions, reputations that reestablish dependence. Even in the age of information abundance, autonomy remains a threat. Yet beneath all this control lies a deeper paradox. The system depends on the creativity of the very individuals it tries to subdue. Every breakthrough, every paradigm shift, every act of genius emerges from those who refuse to stay within prescribed boundaries. The system feeds on the energy of its rebels while punishing them for their rebellion. In this sense, the autodidact isn't merely resisting the system. He's completing it, bringing balance to a world that forgot its soul in the pursuit of order. But such balance comes at a cost. To walk outside the system's architecture means to walk without its protections. As Jean-Jacques Rousseau once said, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." The autodidact simply sees the chains for what they are and begins slowly, methodically, to break them. The question then becomes, if the system depends on obedience, how does one remain truly free without being destroyed by it? Freedom begins in the mind, and so does enslavement. The true genius of the system lies not in its external structures, but in its ability to shape the inner world, to turn the individual sense of self into an instrument of control. To make you distrust your own judgment is to make you dependent forever. The system doesn't simply want obedience. It wants self-policing. It wants you to silence your own intuition before it ever challenges authority. That's how it wins, not through punishment, but through persuasion. The most efficient tyranny is psychological, not political. Alan Watts often described this as the double bind of modern society. We are told to be independent thinkers, but only within the limits of what the system approves. We're praised for creativity so long as it can be monetized. We're encouraged to be ourselves, provided that self fits the mold. It's a game that keeps you chasing authenticity while ensuring you never find it. The autodidact, however, plays by a different rulebook. Their authority doesn't come from consensus or validation. It comes from direct experience. They learn by confronting reality itself, not the filtered versions handed down through institutions. And this is where the system's war becomes most vicious, because the self-taught mind is immune to one of its strongest weapons, fear of being wrong. From early schooling, we're conditioned to associate mistakes with shame. Every red mark on a page whispers, "You are inadequate." Every failed test becomes a small humiliation that teaches us to avoid risk, to fear our own imperfection. The result? A generation terrified of thinking for itself. We no longer ask, "What is true?" but rather, "What answer is expected?" The autodidact dismantles this conditioning. To teach oneself is to embrace error as a teacher, not a threat. It's to fail repeatedly and find meaning in the failure itself. Such resilience terrifies systems built on fragile hierarchies, because once an individual stops fearing mistakes, they also stop fearing authority. But the psychological war runs deeper still. The system has learned to disguise conformity as virtue. It calls submission teamwork, compliance professionalism, and dependence trust. And slowly, imperceptibly, the individual begins to confuse obedience with belonging. We internalize the need for external approval until our very sense of self becomes a reflection of others' expectations. The autodidact breaks that mirror. Their confidence comes not from applause but from the intimate dialogue between self and world. They cultivate what Carl Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating one's own contradictions rather than conforming to external standards. This is the true mark of intellectual maturity, and it's precisely what the system suppresses. Why? Because an individuated person cannot be easily governed. They no longer crave validation, they no longer panic without structure, and they cannot be manipulated through status or shame. The system thrives on people who doubt themselves. The autodidact trusts his own perception. Consider how modern media, education, and commerce operate in psychological unison to erode self-reliance. You are told what to think about, what to desire, even what to fear. Algorithms study your behavior not to enlighten you, but to keep you predictable. Every recommendation, every suggested idea, subtly narrows your mental horizon. You are being taught, continuously, not to trust your curiosity but to defer to the collective. In this landscape, the self-taught mind becomes an act of resistance. To follow your own curiosity is to rebel against the programming. To say, "I will learn this because it fascinates me," is to reclaim the sovereignty of your inner world. It's a psychological declaration of independence. And yet, this independence comes with solitude. Autodidacts often feel alienated because they've stepped outside the shared dream. They see the mechanisms of influence too clearly to be comforted by them. It's lonely to awaken in a world that profits from sleep. But solitude is not suffering. It's the soil of originality. In silence, the autodidact hears the voice that institutions drown out, the quiet, ancient rhythm of their own awareness. Once you learn to trust that rhythm, you become ungovernable. As Soren Kierkegaard wrote, "The greatest hazard of all, losing oneself, can occur very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing at all." The autodidact refuses that quiet death. He chooses the storm of self-discovery over the comfort of collective sleep. But if reclaiming inner authority liberates the individual, it raises an unsettling question. What happens when thousands begin to do the same? When the self-taught stop being isolated sparks and become a wildfire? Picture a city at dusk, streets glowing with screens, minds pulsing in synchronized rhythms of distraction. Everyone scrolling, reacting, consuming, producing. The system hums contentedly, like a vast machine fueled by attention. But somewhere within that glowing grid, a few lights flicker differently. They're not watching the same stories, not believing the same slogans. They've unplugged not from technology but from dependency. They're thinking for themselves. And suddenly, the system begins to shiver. This is the collective anxiety that haunts every age of control, the fear that too many individuals might wake up at once. When one mind becomes autonomous, the system can ignore it. When thousands do, the narrative collapses. Intellectual independence spreads like contagion because freedom is viral. It infects anyone who witnesses it. Alan Watts often compared society to an organism terrified of its own parts becoming self-aware. The system, as we call it, isn't a villain with a face. It's a living network of institutions, economies, and beliefs that sustains itself through consensus. It depends on conformity not because it is evil, but because it is fragile. A system that claims to know the truth must suppress those who discover their own. Collective stability requires psychological agreement, a shared script about what is real, what is valuable, and who we should be. When an autodidact questions that script, it threatens not just authority but identity. Those still inside the system experience this as dissonance, even danger. They label the self-taught as arrogant, rebellious, or delusional, not because they are wrong, but because they unsettle the social equilibrium. This is why history repeats the same pattern. Prophets become outcasts, visionaries become heretics, innovators become threats. Socrates was executed for corrupting the youth because he taught them to think independently of the state. Giordano Bruno was burned for imagining infinite worlds. Galileo was condemned for seeing what others refused to see. Every age pretends to love free thought, yet fears it the moment it stops being convenient. And so the system manufactures a collective reflex against intellectual autonomy. We are taught to equate rebellion with danger, nonconformity with chaos, self-education with arrogance. The media amplifies this fear through caricatures. The conspiracy theorist, the pseudo-intellectual, the lone radical. It's not that independent thinkers are always right. It's that the system must delegitimize the very act of independent thought to preserve its coherence. But the fear runs deeper than politics or ideology. It's existential. If individuals awaken to their own power, they no longer need the myths that hold society together, the myths of progress, hierarchy, and dependency. Imagine a population that understands its own intelligence without mediation, its own capacity for meaning without consumption. The economy, as we know it, would tremble. Advertising would lose its grip. Institutions would lose their authority. The machine would lose its fuel. Yet, paradoxically, this same autonomy could save the system from its decay. For every structure eventually collapses under the weight of its own conformity. Without innovation, without minds that think freely, the system suffocates. It dies not from rebellion, but from stagnation. The autodidact, therefore, is both the system's greatest threat and its potential redeemer. The system's anxiety mirrors our own. We fear standing alone in thought because we've internalized the belief that meaning is collective, that to disagree is to be exiled. But true individuality does not reject the collective. It transforms it. The self-taught mind contributes not by echoing consensus, but by revealing deeper dimensions of reality. This is what's called the dance of opposites, the eternal interplay between order and chaos, system and freedom. When one dominates, the other rebels. The system suppresses the autodidact. The autodidact revitalizes the system. The two need each other, but their relationship is never peaceful. Still, most systems choose the illusion of stability over the risk of awakening. They would rather lull their populations into passive comfort than face the creative storm that true education would unleash. And so the collective anxiety persists, humming beneath the surface of every institution, every ideology, every nation built on control. As Hannah Arendt once wrote, the most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution. Even freedom, once institutionalized, becomes fearful of its own reflection. And yet, there remains a question that trembles at the heart of this paradox. If both system and rebel are bound in this endless dance, can true liberation ever exist? Or is it simply the courage to keep dancing without permission? There comes a moment in every age when the machinery of civilization begins to creak under its own weight, when systems built for order become too rigid to allow renewal. That is the moment when the autodidact reappears, not as a relic of rebellion but as the seed of rebirth. The self-taught mind, which once frightened society, becomes the architect of its future. But this transformation does not come gently. Every revolution in consciousness begins as heresy. To learn outside the system is to walk through wilderness, to feel the silence of exile before the echo of creation. The autodidact stands at the border between the dying order and the new one still being imagined. He is misunderstood by both, too wild for the institutions, too structured for the anarchists. Yet it is precisely in this tension that civilization evolves. Alan Watts once said that the only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. The autodidact embodies this philosophy. While the system clings to stability, the self-taught learner flows with the current of transformation. He does not wait for permission to adapt. He becomes adaptation itself. Consider how every major leap in human history began not within institutions, but outside them. The Renaissance flourished because artists and thinkers broke away from dogmatic schooling. The birth of modern science was led by men and women experimenting in basements and monasteries, long before there were scientific institutions. Even today, many of the world's great innovators, from programmers to philosophers, emerge from the margins, guided not by curriculum but by obsession. The autodidact does not reject systems entirely. He transcends them. He sees that every institution, however oppressive it may seem, is simply a tool, a temporary framework created by human thought. To outgrow the system, then, is not to destroy it, but to remember that it was never divine. It is clay, not stone, can be reshaped. This perspective is what separates true independence from mere defiance. Many who rebel against the system fall into another form of dependence, defining themselves by opposition. The autodidact's freedom is subtler. He learns from the system without being owned by it. He studies the rules not to obey or reject them, but to understand the deeper patterns beneath them. In this sense, he becomes a bridge between chaos and order, a living dialogue between tradition and innovation. The future belongs to those who can navigate this dialogue, who can merge the discipline of structure with the wildness of self-discovery. Our civilization stands at a crossroads where institutional education can no longer keep pace with the world it helped create. Technology evolves faster than curriculums. Wisdom lags behind information. In such an age, the self-taught mind becomes essential, not optional. Yet this future also demands something deeper than intellectual skill. The autodidact must cultivate empathy, humility, and a sense of wonder. Knowledge without compassion becomes another hierarchy. Learning without love becomes another form of control. The new era of self-education must not merely produce clever individuals. It must awaken wise ones. People who understand that freedom is not isolation, but connection without coercion. The ultimate task of the autodidact is therefore not escape, but integration. To move beyond the system is to return to it consciously, to participate without being consumed, to create systems that serve life rather than dominate it. The self-taught mind becomes not an enemy of civilization, but its renewal. Perhaps this is the paradox Alan Watts would leave us with. The autodidact's rebellion is not against society itself, but against unconsciousness. His learning is an act of remembering that intelligence is not something granted by authority but something intrinsic to being. The system may always fear such freedom, but it also depends on it for survival. Every awakening mind adds oxygen to the collective flame. Each question born in solitude becomes a light for others lost in conformity. And when enough lights begin to burn, the darkness no longer defines the room. The system does not disappear, it transforms. It becomes, once again, a tool in service of consciousness rather than its master. As the philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti wrote, It is no measure of health to be well-adjusted to a profoundly sick society. The autodidact, by refusing such adjustment, becomes the doctor of the collective soul. And perhaps that is how every true renaissance begins, not with revolution, but with one person, somewhere in the quiet, daring to learn without permission.